Hi guys, this is Connie, back for some more Connie Reads Brian's Hunt. You will see and hear baby bear here, but that's the noise in the background. Here we go, Chapter 7. Brian boiled lake mud and packed it, still wet but not hot on the wound. Much of it fell off, but some stayed and seemed to help, and while he was doing it, he thought of a better solution. He would get spruce and pine gum from tree sap where it formed on the trunks and melt it and put that over the wound. That stuff stuck to everything. He thought, I'll do that when we stop this evening. He smiled. He was already thinking and saying, we. It was like the dog had always been there. He ate a little of the rabbit meat and 2 of the fish and gave the rest to the dog, still in the pot. And the dog ate everything, fish heads, bone, rabbit bones, meat, and then drank all the broth and looked at Brian in open gratitude, wagging her tail and folding her ears down in a submissive gesture. My, you were hungry, weren't you? Brian cleaned the pot and loaded the canoe, wondering how it would all work. He had become competent with a canoe, perhaps even expert, but he had never tried to take a large dog with him. Canoes were not the most stable of craft, and a dog going crazy would pretty much upset the whole apple cart. He tied the cargo down well and used a bit of cord to lash his bow and quiver so that if they rolled, all the gear would stay with the canoe. He needn't have worried. He pushed the canoe into the shallows, turned it until it was sideways to the bank, and turned to get the dog, but she jumped in ahead of the cargo and sat down and waited for Brian to get in. Clearly, Brian thought, the dog had been in canoes before, as she would have done if she had been a Cree camp dog. He pushed off and had not gone 20 yards when the dog's full stomach, the warm sun, and the rocking motion of the boat combined, and the dog lay down on the floor of the canoe and went to sleep. Brian stroked evenly, using a long reach and a straight pull back to move the canoe in a steady flow forward. There were thousands of lakes in the North Country, and almost all of them were connected by streams or small rivers. The general flow was north or northwest, although there was a lot of meandering through low hills. Brian moved to the north end of the lake, looking for the outlet, and saw a beaver dam across the stream that flowed there. He had to unload the canoe on top of the dam, lower it by hand, and repack it in the stream below. It was the only thing he didn't like about the Kevlar canoe. It was light and wonderfully strong, but too flexible for hard work. He knew the Crees had heavy old thick fiberglass canoes, and when they came to a beaver dam like this, they would simply get up ahead of steam and just slide over the top of it down the far side and off into the stream. But the dog jumped nimbly out of the canoe and back in with no problem, and they followed the stream 4 or 5 miles, moving through several ponds and over 5 more beaver dams before coming to another lake. Because of the time spent going over dams, it was coming on to evening, time to find a place to stop before dark, so he could catch some fish and maybe do an evening hunt for small deer. They had seen 4 moose during the day, feeding in the ponds, and 2 of them would have been easy kills. Brian had come very close on one of them, a small bull, but still, he was over 600 pounds, and even with the dog, that was too much meat to deal with, and he didn't want to waste it. The dog's reaction to the moose had been interesting. Rather than bark or whine or even make a fuss, the dog had merely crouched in the canoe, laid its ears down to lower its silhouette, and watched in silence, now and then looking back at Brian as if to say, "Aren't you going to shoot?" He found a flat piece, or next words and phrases. He found a flat place near the outlet to the stream onto the next lake and pulled into the shore. "Out," he said to the dog, which he had been doing with each beaver pond, and the dog obeyed. Brian let the canoe drift back out and used the fish arrow to spear a dozen small panfish. There were hundreds under the lily pads. He used a piece of string for a stringer, which he fed through their gills, and left them in the water to keep. He tied the dog up again, took the bow with his quiver, and moved into the brush. From the canoe, he had seen another clearing farther up the shore, and he knew white-tailed deer liked to come into clearings in the late day, probably to get away from the flies in any evening breeze. He moved as silently as possible through the trees and thick willows toward the clearing. He stopped and watched a rabbit move past him and freeze into what would have been an easy shot and a quick kill. Good meat, but he felt confident about the clearing and didn't want to take a chance. He had become extremely good with the bow, exceptional. Twice now he had taken grouse on the wing, an almost impossible shot. He knew he was good. He was good with a bow because his eyes were quick, and he saw inside things, where the arrow had to go, and saw the arrow almost as a line of light to the place where it should hit. Not a target, not for fun, as an extension of his mind in an almost zen state, but for one thing and one thing only, to hunt. To see where the arrow would have to go to make food, to make meat, to make, oddly, life out of death. The Cree family had thought him strange at first because he still used a bow while they had 30-30 rifles. But then they had seen him shoot and seen how much a part of the kill he became with the bow and arrows he had made for himself, not with these modern laminates and truly straight shafts. And they had thought him like the old ones, the ones who knew the old ways and had respected him for it. He stopped well short of the clearing before he could see anything and before any deer could see or hear him. And this time he was rewarded. There were 4 deer in the clearing. Carefully, he inch-stepped by inch-step moved to the edge of the thick willows and parted the leaves with the point on his arrow knocked in the bowstring, ready. 2 doe, 2 bucks, one old with a large rack and thick velvet, the other a young spike buck with small single antlers, even thicker velvet. The old buck would be too tough and fat. Doe had the best meat, but he hated to shoot them because there was a slight chance they might be pregnant. So it was the young buck. The deer did not know he was there, and he waited patiently, controlling his breath, waiting. 20 yards to the young buck, maybe less. 15. A bird flew from the other side of the clearing, and the deer were startled by the sudden flight, but it was merely birds squabbling, and they did not run. The buck took a step, paused, stood not 15 yards now from where Brian hid in the willows, then turned its head away. Perfect. Brian drew the broadhead back until it nearly touched the bow, sliding the wooden shaft on his finger so it wouldn't make noise rubbing on the arrow rest on the bow. Aimed just above the shoulder blade, knowing the arrow would drop a bit in flight. Held it for an instant to be sure, then released. The arrow flew clean, left the willows without touching anything, and seemed to disappear against, and then into the buck. The young buck jumped, seemed to arch in the middle, took 3 faltering steps, and lay down on his side. Brian waited. The other deer still had not run, were merely watching the small buck as if curious, and Brian stood that way quietly, letting the arrow do its work for a few seconds, and then the buck laid its head over, facing east, as so many animals did when they died, and the light went out of its eyes, and he ceased to be a deer and became meat, food. Thank you, Brian thought. Thank you again. And still he stood, and still the other deer did not run, although the bigger buck came over and smelled the young one as it lay dead. Then Brian stepped out into the clearing, and the whole world blew up. The deer exploded in huge bounds that had them out of the clearing and gone in fractions of a second. Brian moved to the small buck. He poked it with his bow to make sure it was truly dead. The arrow had gone clean through and lay in the grass on the other side, 10 or 12 feet away. Brian picked it up, used his fingers to wipe the blood off, and squeegee the feathers so they would dry straight. Then he cut the deer's throat to bleed it, and began the drag back to camp. He would normally have dressed the deer out and left the guts, but he wanted them for the dog, especially the heart and liver. It was 400 yards to camp, not very far, but through thick brush. It was almost dark by the time he had dragged the deer back. The dog whimpered when he arrived and wagged her tail, and Brian put a pot of water on to boil. He was dying of thirst. He gathered wood for a long fire. He would be dressing and skidding and cutting the deer after dark, and would need light. Big feed, he said to the dog, taking out his knife and the stone. Big feed tonight and tomorrow. We'll stay here and eat. And from the way the dog was wagging so hard she nearly fell down, she agreed completely. And that's the end of chapter 7. Be careful with that and enjoy, please and thank you. And I will see you next week for the next installment. Have a great one. Bye.